Today I'd like to talk about how to get a good white background using flash for portrait photography lighting. Now, you'd think it'd be pretty easy to get a nice, clean, solid white background for a basic portrait, right? But it can be a little tricky to pull off. And what we're going to talk about today is how attempts to create this look can fail. And I'm going to show you how to successfully create a simple, clean white background, as well as some techniques for wraparound lighting, to get those ethereal effects. And we'll discuss a few other things concerning lighter colored backgrounds. White backgrounds are actually pretty easy to create. There's really nothing mysterious about creating a solid white background. I mean, if you think about it, what's an easy way to make a completely solid white area in an image? Now, forget about having a subject in your image for a minute. Just think of a solid white area, okay? The easiest way is just to overexpose it. Blow out the detail completely, and you've got solid white. This is easy to do if you point your camera at a white wall or a seamless backdrop and just blast it with light and overexpose the shot. Simple, solid white, right? But things get a little complicated when we introduce a subject into our foreground. And if you think about it, a completely blown out white background isn't always what we're really after anyway. So a white background isn't always white. Here's something that trips people up, and maybe it's happened to you when you're trying to create a nice white background effect for a portrait. Maybe you've seen someone else do it, and you think it's a simple process of just throwing up a white seamless or a fabric backdrop and just placing your subject a few feet from the background. And after you take the shot, and you end up with like this dull or gray-looking background, or a background with uneven hot spots. This happens because proper lighting and exposure techniques aren't being used. And, if you're only using, like, let's say an on-camera flash, or even if you're using off-camera flash intended primarily to illuminate the subject, you can run into these problems. All right, think about it this way. In this situation that we discussed, you can't just use your flash to just blast enough light across the whole scene in the effort to overexpose the background, because it'll also overexpose your subject. So because the goal is to use just enough light to properly expose your subject, the background isn't going to get enough light to be totally white. And because you'll have a little distance between the subject and the background, usually, the key light is also going to be farther away from the background. And this decreases the intensity of the light against the background. And depending on the exposure, your white background can reproduce as white or gray or even completely black. It just depends on the distance between the background and whatever light it's catching. Now, I'm just going to mention an important point here. A completely solid white background with no detail isn't always the best look. And like right here. Here our model is sitting on the floor. And fortunately, there is some detail there in the shadows here that grounds her, to the floor. If that detail wasn't there, it would look pretty weird. Kind of like she's just floating in space. It just looked very artificial. All right, the basic white background. Okay, there are actually several ways to create a white background for your portraits, and you can do this in camera or in post. Now, in post, it might be just a matter of using a tool like this in Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom. And here, this is where you can make a selection around the subject and just really easily just drop in a realistic white backdrop. If you know what you're doing, this can look pretty convincing. But let's talk about doing this in camera. Okay, that's the goal that we're trying to, everybody always says, try to get it right in camera instead of trying to fix things in post. So under the best circumstances, you'll have enough room to work with and you'll have the lighting you need. But even if you don't, you can still make pretty good use of the principles that I'm going to talk about and get the best possible outcome. Okay, let's start with a basic white background lighting setup. Now, this is really simplified what I'm showing you here, but it shows you what basically you're trying to do. The idea is to cover the background evenly, okay? Now, we're using our key light and our camera settings to expose the subject normally or properly. But we can light our background independently any way we want with as much or as little light as we want to use. If you use more light on the background, it gives you a brighter background. Less light gives you a darker background, right? I mean, that makes sense. All right, so let's talk about a setup like this. If we were going to do this, we'd place two lights out of frame on either side of the background, preferably a few feet from the subject to help avoid, that light spill onto the subject. And the light should be pointed toward the background at approximately 45-degree angles. And the idea here is to spread and feather the light evenly across the width of the background. And like I show here, you might want to flag the lights to prevent light spill on the subject and possible flare into the camera, depending on the angle and position of the lights. Now, place your main light and your fill, or whatever other lights you're using for your subject, as needed for the angle of coverage that you're shooting for on the subject. Now, for full-length shots, the lights for the subject will likely be several feet in front of the subject, producing a result similar to this one here. And for headshots, you might want to bring the lights in closer. That's what I usually do. And remember, these are the lights that you're most concerned with as they relate to your camera settings, because these are the lights that pertain to your subject. So the lights that are illuminating your subject and how you expose your subject, that's the number one, that's your primary concern here. Maybe think of the background and the background lighting as a completely separate lighting scenario. Now let's talk about wraparound lighting, okay? Now the basic white background gives us a clean, crisp way to present our subject. As you've seen, as long as the background lighting is even and just crosses a little into the overexposure zone, you'll have a nice white background. If you go much beyond that, you'll get something a little less crisp and a little more what I'd call ethereal looking. This is wraparound lighting, and it gets its name from the way that light seems to reach around from behind the subject to sort of wrap itself around the subject. And this effect becomes visible as your exposure settings allow more light to bleed around the edges of the subject in sort of an overexposed backlighting scenario. This is really a mood effect, and it can be accomplished with or without the use of a main light on the subject. Another way to do this is using the light source as a background. Here you can give the subject a bright white or even a blown out background. And what you're using is a light source itself, like a big softbox, and you're not using the reflection on a background like we did before. Now, there is a potential side effect here, and that's flare, because what you're doing is you're pointing the light directly at the camera, but the subject is blocking part of that light. So that's one thing to watch out for. And this kind of effect can be done even with natural window light. Now, this whole effect of a light source as a background, it can be a little tricky to work with, and it has some, limited uses for portraiture, but it can sometimes come in handy for some nice effects. All right, what if you don't have extra lighting for the background? You only have one light to work with. You can still produce interesting white background portraits, especially in smaller rooms with light-colored walls, where you can use reflected light or bounce lighting to your advantage. All right, so if you just take your light and you just blast the background behind your subject from either side and adjust your exposure settings, you can overexpose the background, and then you bring out your subject at the same time because of the settings you're using. And you can help this effect along in post by just playing with the exposure settings. Now, if you do have at least two lights, then you can use one of your lights as the main light, and that should help things out. Again, lots of times, depending on how much lighting you have and how much time you have to work with to set your lights up, lots of times you can do this in camera, and that's the preferred way to do it. But lots of times you're going to need a little extra help in post, where you can sort of clean up hot spots or even things out a little bit. But the idea here is that this is a pretty easy thing to accomplish if you know how. The main thing is you can't just throw up a white background, use one light, and expect to have a really bright, crisp white background. So I've shown you some ways that you can do this properly. So try these techniques out, and I think you'll have some success at creating some good, clean, solid, believable white backgrounds. Hey, if you've got some techniques that you like to use to create some nice looking white backgrounds, leave those tips in the comments to share with others. Don't forget to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. All right, that's about all I've got for you today. See you next time.